Recording.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Puck Curtis, and I'm here with my co-host Eric Byers, and we are part of the Sacramento Sword School. And tonight we have Lois Spangler, who's going to be presenting on Pacheco's edited version of Carranza's first dialogue. So just a little bit about Lois. She started learning swordsmanship through iaido, or did I say that right?
iaido.
iaido. And she found HEMA once she moved to Australia and joined the Brisbane School of Iberian Swordsmanship in its founding year. 6 years of European fencing, nearly 5 of those Destreza. She considers herself fairly new to the scene, but she's a professional bilingual writer and editor with over 25 years of experience. And she uses her professional experience to bring Destreza primary sources to English-speaking audiences. She has an original and sharp eye for research, a really great author's voice. She's collaborated on works with Figueredo, Pacheco, and the Carranza texts, and we're just all really pleased to have her doing this work. A lot of the work that she's going to be talking about tonight was funded by her Patreon, which I encourage you to go look at. All you have to do is type in Lois Spangler and Patreon into Google, and you'll find it as the first hit, but I'm also going to post a link in the chat. So Eric, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, we're just super excited to have her back again for another fantastic talk.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity for people who haven't had access to Carranza to get their first real taste of it. And I'm really excited. So Lois, if you'll take it away, we're excited.
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say this presentation won't be anywhere near as organized or smooth as my previous one, because every time I started looking into one little thing, another thing opened up, and then another thing opened up, and then another thing opened up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a quick PowerPoint presentation talking about brief background on the work, and then some important Aristotelian concepts that I need you to sort of have a grasp of before we dive into the text. And what you're going to see with that text is you're going to see my editorial work. You're going to see how I do editorial stuff. It is a PDF of my first dialogue, and it's going to be highlighted in all sorts of different places. And some highlights you'll see are going to be, oh, here's a translation I want to fix. And some highlights are going to be, oh, I screwed up the transcription of the Spanish. That messed a whole bunch of stuff up. But the main thing you're going to see are blue highlights. And all of those blue highlights are places where I found all of the Aristotle. So let me go ahead and start sharing my presentation. But along those lines of all of the Aristotle, as it were, the reason I ended up crashing into this Aristotle stuff is because in Spanish, the terms that are used for Aristotelian concepts don't always add up to what the English uses. And I got stuck on the word potencia, or potential. And after figuring out that potencia in Spanish, when it comes to Aristotle, could mean act and potential, like things that are in potential do not actually come into being until they become an action. Or it could mean the faculties of the human soul, which include the senses and also includes reason and intellect and virtues and stuff like that. Once that clicked, everything else started cascading away. So here we go. And this title is absolutely true. I sure hope you know your Aristotle, because I sure didn't before this. So in this presentation, I strongly suspect I'm going to be appearing a bit like these two fine people, because it really was just Aristotle all the way down. I know I'm talking it up a lot, but yeah, it really is there. Not only, like Puck's already talked about how the golden mean, you know, the virtuous middle is present in the book, and he's talked about how the four causes are in the book. Those two principles are in service to something bigger, which is Carranza's effort to make he wants to make LVD into a science. And the reason he wants to make LVD into a science is so that he can use prudence to dictate actions within a fight. And that may sound kind of esoteric, but I'm going to walk you through that in a moment. Anyway, briefly, the Compendio is Pacheco's highly abridged rendition of Carranza's seminal text. It was released in 1612, which I think is really interesting because Grandezas is 1600, so I don't know what's going on there. Interestingly, in the first dialogue, Pacheco only retains a third of Carranza's text. Now, I haven't read the whole of Carranza's first dialogue, but in the little spot checks I've done, I do agree with Pacheco's omissions because, like, there's a whole conversation about why it's a great idea to have a picture of a wharf in your study. Because it's all about commerce and communication. And anyway, it has very little to do with fencing, but may actually have some strong implications with continuing to put forward the case that Destreza is a science and this is how we science it up. So, one other tiny thing to note is that for the most part, Pacheco does not, when somebody says something, he leaves those words in that character's mouth, but at the very end of the first dialogue, he doesn't. He takes words that are spoken by, I think, Polemarco. We can take a look at the footnote when we get there. And he puts them in Charilao's mouth. And I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know if it was necessary, but anyway. So, what's in the first dialogue? Well, there are 4 dialogues in Carranza's book. The first dialogue lays out the science of arms, the theory behind it, all of the underlying theory. We can safely say first principles, and you'll see why when we get there. The second is pure rhetoric. And when I say rhetoric, I mean like classical rhetoric, because Carranza is poking at your emotions by using satire to ridicule the vulgar maestro, who is demonstrating faulty fencing principles. I haven't read the third or the fourth, but I do know that the third dialogue applies the science of the first. So there aren't many illustrations in the philosophy of arms, but all the ones that appear in the third dialogue. So I am both really looking forward to looking through that and also absolutely terrified that it's going to be even more Aristotle and my head's going to explode. The fourth book is I'm personally going to find it interesting because it's all about the ethical issues around defending your own life and potentially ending the life of another in order to preserve your own life. That in itself screams Nicomachean ethics, but Nicomachean ethics is present all throughout the first dialogue. And I promise you we'll see why. So, originally when I approached this work, this is kind of what I thought. I thought, oh yeah, you know, here's Destreza, and you can shove a bunch of Aristotle into it. But no, it's actually the other way around. When I talk about the Corpus Aristotelicum, I'm talking about the Aristotelian texts that were available to people in Europe post 1300, and these books formed the foundation of pretty much every liberal arts education degree that you could get in Europe at the time. Interestingly enough, Carranza's from Seville, and Seville had a university, a formalized, royally recognized university in that city since the year of like 1505. It is clear from the words Carranza uses and how he uses them that he not only did he complete the trivium, which is grammar, which is naming things, logic, which is building statements about those things that you can then prove or deny, and rhetoric, which is convincing people about things. And it's clear that he's got at least some familiarity with the quadrivium, which is math, music, astronomy, and it's like the 7 dwarves. I'm going to forget one. But there's pure number, mathematics. There's number in space, which is geometry. That's the one I missed. There's number in time, which is music, and there's number in space and time, which is astronomy. All right. So with that said, one of the key thing that Carranza is trying to do here is establish la verdadera destreza, the true skill at arms, as a science. Not all knowledge is the same when we're talking about knowledge from an Aristotelian logic point of view. There's opinion, there's other stuff, there's like axioms that come from history and tradition. Opinion is justified belief. You can say, well, I believe this thing because of this, but if your justifications are not true, then it's not scientific knowledge. And the word scientific knowledge will appear alongside science and alongside art and mean the same thing. It all means episteme. And if you've heard epistemology, that's what we're talking about. It is knowing things about the world. So, the way that we reach episteme, the way that we reach true, justified belief about the qualities of the world, is through syllogisms, God help me, founded in first principles. We'll get to first principles in a second. One of the important things we have to remember when it comes to science, when it comes to episteme, is that it's talking about universals. It's talking about larger categorical structures. It's not about, oh, this pair of jeans has a rip in it. It's blue jeans are generally of this shape, and they're made of this material. And if you're thinking I'm starting to talk about four causes, you're right. That's one of the places it comes into play. The reason that science is important when we start to come into the particular, and it's good to talk about the difference between universal and particular here. Universal is that upper level of knowledge. It's something that describes portions of the world that we live in to a broad extent. So humans are mammals, and they generally have a bilateral body plan with 2 arms and 2 legs, and they walk on their legs. They don't walk on all fours. And they've got hair on top of their head, generally, but the rest of the hair on their body, for the most part, is quite thin. Blah. Right? So that is a universal. That is a universal concept. Me, as a person, Lois, I'm particular. I am one example of a human being. And then, interestingly enough, the space between the universal and the particular, it's just a whole lot of generals. Yeah, genus, generals. I have ideas about that. We'll see if we get to that later on. Anyway, so science deals in universals. Science is true justified belief about the world founded in first principles. Okay. How do we bring that knowledge into our particular situation? Like, generally speaking, fires are bad and we want to put them out. But sometimes, in particular situations, a fire is a good thing. We might be burning a fire break to save homes. We might be burning bedclothes that were used by plague patients. So there are certain particular situations in which the actual virtuous middle doesn't lie directly between the excesses. It doesn't lie between the extremes. It lies closer to one extreme or another because of situational information. How do you evaluate situational information in such a way that you make a virtuous decision? Well, that would be prudence. Prudence applies episteme, true justified belief about the qualities of the world, to a particular situation. The particulars of a situation are grasped by the senses, and this becomes important later on. That's one of the connective tissues where the 4 causes exists. The particulars of a situation are grasped by the senses: sight, smell, sound, touch, and are understood. They're synthesized through reason. Virtues come into play because virtues are the beneficial habits of the soul that avoid excess and deficiency and show the correct end. Prudence provides the best mean to the end. So virtue says, here's a situation, that's the goal that you want. And prudence says, this is the best way to get to that goal. With best being tied to Nicomachean ethics concepts of good, which generally has to do with being beneficial to human beings and society in a measured way. Okay. Syllogisms. Syllogisms play a huge role in the background radiation of thought of this text. Because when you come to Aristotelian logic, which would have been one of the founding conceptual frameworks for the education that Carranza would have received, the way that you arrive at truth is through the syllogism. It is the structure and process used to establish true things. Deductive syllogisms, if the structure of your syllogism is correct, if it's not invalid, and your premises are true, then it is guaranteed that your conclusion is going to be true. How do we know that our premises are true? They rely on first principles. And there's ways to get to first principles, to sort of facts that you don't have to shore up with underlying evidence. And one of those, to a limited extent, is experience, and we'll see experience show up in the text. But generally speaking, math is an agreed upon first principle. Mathematical concepts like the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, and geometry, that a line is the two-dimensional space between two endpoints, and that at the edge of a geometrical figure is where two planes meet. That kind of stuff is all considered first principle by agreement. You don't need to back that up. If you use that as a premise, you don't need to provide further evidence that that premise is true. Inductive syllogisms, they take specific information and then make probable generalizations. So like, my specific information might be an observation about the weather outside my house. Okay, the weather's coming, the wind is coming from the east, and it's around the middle of July. And every time the wind has come from the east and it's around the middle of July, we're in for some rain. So I can then induce that it will probably rain sometime soon. So you're taking small information layered with experience and making a larger generalization, which has the potential to be false. So you can't rely on inductions to be 100% dead true. Right. So I'm going to go into syllogism structure because it will come into play in the book to help explain some things. So, Eric, look, it's proposition. When you're talking about a syllogism is built of terms, and those terms are formal predicables. They are words that can be used to describe a thing. So if any of you are familiar with Aristotle's categories, that's what's going on there. Especially there's a point where there's a bit of a conversation about a thing cannot be black and white in the same time. And that is a thing being black or white. Those colors are accidental. They're not essential to the thing. So like for me, what is essential to me is that I have hair, I've got 2 hands, but what is accidental to me is that I'm wearing a black t-shirt. It's a part of a description of me right now, but I don't have to have the t-shirt to be me. So we've got our terms, and a proposition is a statement that asserts something. It includes those terms in such a way that it says X. Premises and conclusions are propositions. They just operate a little bit differently. The premises lead to a conclusion, as long as the argument is correctly structured, and as long as the premises are true. So the major premise contains the broadest knowledge, the minor premise contains the less broad knowledge, and the conclusion contains precise knowledge derived from the interaction of the two premises. And we're pretty familiar with the classic example of all men are human, Aristotle is a man, therefore Aristotle is human. Here's where it gets interesting. There is a concept called the practical syllogism, and it's still a contentious thing today in philosophical circles. Aristotle does not, he doesn't mark out what a practical syllogism is. He doesn't say this is how you apply the syllogism structure to action, but he uses the syllogism structure at the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, Book 7, when he's talking about the incontinent man, basically somebody who is on the excess of being driven by their desires, and uses the syllogism structure to show where the problem is in the incontinent man's thinking. So the premises in a practical syllogism are combinations of scientific knowledge and opinion, and can also be informed by the senses. They can also be informed by sensory information. The conclusion in a practical syllogism is an action. It is not a new piece of knowledge. It is the thing you're going to go do. So the example here actually comes from the book. You know, if you've got a practical syllogism that says all sweet things must be tasted, that over there is a sweet thing. Well, I got to go taste the sweet thing. This structure implies that a practical syllogism can actually be several layers deep, because how do I know that that thing over there is a sweet thing? Ah, well, maybe I observe that it's small and red and has a little green tuft on the top and has little yellow seeds. So I recognize that from my personal experience that it's a strawberry. And I also know from my experience that strawberries are sweet. So therefore, I must taste the thing because it's sweet. So this structure of in time reasoning, of of episteme, of scientific knowledge plus situational knowledge giving you an action, is key to some of the things that are happening in the first dialogue. So, yeah.
Are the parts of a practical syllogism, are they propositions also?
Yes.
So an action can be a proposition in this case.
That's correct. That is correct. That's exactly right.
I also have a question before we go on. So you talked about prudence, and the medio came up, but it seems to me that prudence is sort of the scales on which medios are judged. Is that your take on it?
That's a good way to summarize it. I didn't talk too deeply about prudence because once we get into examples in my markup, there's places where I can talk more deeply about prudence and how it's operating. But yes, prudence is what gives you the means. It tells you how to do the thing. It takes the virtues, and it takes your current understanding of the situation, and then pulls in some episteme to give you broad knowledge about what you're observing, and then gives you that balanced information so that you can take that action, so that you can take the most centered, reasonable, virtuous action in that situation at that time.
Can I make a little insertion there?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brent. So Carranza specifically says that prudence counsels us in those things that we do or wish to do, right? And that the contemplation of wisdom helps science and prudence. So yeah, so and it's similar to what you're saying, that notion that prudence
and I'm
counsels on the basis of experience.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up wisdom, because that's going to come up in the text. So you've already drawn a conclusion that's similar to some of the stuff that I've observed and some of the conclusions that I've made. So to me, I find that comforting. Thank you. But yes, I would agree.
Just so you know, folio 57 verso. On the Carranza, in the original Carranza, folio 57 verso has that comment about science and prudence. So if you just want that as a note.
Yes, it will take me a moment to grab a notepad to get that down. Actually, can you write it in the?
I will send it to you in
chat?
the chat. How about that?
Yeah, that'd be perfect.
Okay.
All right. So, right, the thing I want to take you to is this beast. So, are you all seeing the PDF?
Not yet.
Well, that's annoying. Let me see. There we go. I want to share content. Right, there we go. That's what I want to share. So share that instead. All right.
Got it.
Are you?
There we
Yeah,
go.
you're seeing that screen now? Great. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So, as I go through this document, a lot of it is going to be, oh, look, here's the Aristotle. But in a few places, I also want to show you some things that I think are very important to the conceptions we have about Destreza and how we practice it, and a couple of places where you get to see me make like a silly goof up. Like, for instance, here, how did I miss this pun? Carranza sets the stage for this dialogue in this plaza, and as he's setting the stage, and then people are like, dude, but why are you looking so sad? Oh, it's because I'm thinking of something that bothers me. And then somebody says, oh, well, it looks like you were thinking about the practice of arms. And he goes, dude, not cool. Why would I think about something that makes me so angry and upset? And that's the passage here. He says, you abuse what's owed to a good friendship, because why would you want to want me to put thoughts into what I deal with least and hate the most? Because the skill at arms is nothing more than a vanity ignorant give themselves to, heavy with leaves. Okay. In the Spanish, we have cargada de hojas, like heavy, weighed down with leaves. But the trick is, in Spanish, hoja can also mean blade. I totally missed this pun. It's a beautiful pun. Like, that a vanity ignorant men give themselves to, heavy with blades, these brave people who think they're such badasses, and they're really not. So there you go. Sometimes it can take several passes through a text before you see some of the really cool stuff. All right. So here we go. We're starting to see in this particular section, they're like, all right, Carilao, calm down. It's okay. Don't think about the annoying stuff. Instead, let's refocus you onto what you think is good. Tell us about the good and true theory about the skill at arms. And Carilao is like, okay, why, thank you. And the explanation of this, so like the margin notes are actually kind of cool here. Like we have margin note 5 saying, this is the definition of the true skill. The definition of the true skill is a bit long and complicated, which is annoying, but we can sort of break it down. We've got destreza is, and understanding is incorrect, right? It's a conocimiento, it's a knowledge. Right now, he's already beginning to call up the idea of episteme and habit. Habit is an important term. That's also a very loaded word, because habit and disposition in Nicomachean ethics describe two aspects of a similar thing. A habit is it's a particular arrangement of human capacities that allow you to do things repeatedly. Habit will drive towards the good. Disposition means you have the capacity to drive towards the good, but you won't necessarily do it without a little extra effort, without a little extra push. Dispositions can easily be changed. Habits cannot easily be changed because you've already worked that habit into you. And virtues are habits. So, destreza is an episteme and a habit which shows how to give a wound and to defend against the wounds, the attacks of the opponent. And then we hit the word considerando. And consideración is a loaded term again, because that comes out of the Nicomachean ethics. Consideration is the faculty for judging what is equitable, like you said, for judging what is the most even and true path, the beneficial path. It's an active thing that happens at the level of particulars, not at universals, but it requires perception, aesthesis, to take in information about a given situation and to synthesize it, bringing the intellect, the nous, which is a faculty of the human soul, to enact prudence, which is a kind of excellence in the selection of how to get from point A to point B. Prudence requires virtue. You can't have prudence if you don't have virtue. And then we've got a call out to first principles. So, destreza is a knowledge and a habit that shows how to strike and how to defend against a strike, considering it in the following things, which is this big wodge of stuff, and verifying itself through a consideration of these many things that cannot be verified or proven by anything else. That's a definition of a first principle. A first principle just is. It can't be verified or proven by anything else because it simply is. And then we have this big wodge of qualities. And originally I was thinking about how I could break them down and to match them up into the categories, but that was a futile practice. That did not really get me anywhere. But we do see some of Aristotle's categories showing up here. We see quantity in the size. We see movement in movement. Obviously, the figure is considered. The figure is considered something specific, and I apologize if I start sort of losing my way here. I did not take philosophy at university. All of this Aristotle stuff that I've got in my head right now has been collected over the past 4 months. And it's a bit of a struggle for me to keep everything straight in my head. So take these observations as someone who's trying to who's trying to crash course study Aristotle. We'll try to crash course study Aristotle because they've realized there's Aristotle everywhere, much like those lovely gentlemen at the beginning of the presentation. So here we have a call to terms. Like these are terms that he wants you to be thinking about, because these terms are going to play a role in the propositions that show up later on when you're thinking about what actions to take in a fight. I'm happy to take a tiny bit of a break there in case people have questions or want clarifications.
I would just say I'm experiencing the same thing. You know, the crash course in I mean, Aristotle's just the beginning, right? Is Pliny and Galen and any number of other philosophers. I mean, this is kind of a Carranza is kind of showing off, if you will, his humanist, right? I mean, he is deliberately showing off and trying to make this as elevated as possible to exclude the vulgar masses. And so, which he goes on. I mean, the first dialogue is as much about the exclusion of the vulgar masses and his disdain for the vulgar masses. This work is written for the elite. And that has to be borne in mind when you read it. It's just so dense.
Yeah. And some of it I think is a bit, just showing off, like But what I'm having a hard time finding, though, is figuring out where it's just showing off or where I really need to pay attention to where he's applied these terms.
Yeah, that makes annotation a little difficult, like.
Yeah.
How much do you need to annotate about Galen? Does it really matter,
Yeah. Yeah.
Lois, I had oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I saw Ernesto's question pop up, and the answer is he definitely had most texts had been discovered and propagated after about 1300. So Carranza absolutely had access to the Organon, Nicomachean Ethics, Metaphysics, De Anima. So the texts that I'm referencing here, they were all available to him. I think it's only maybe a tiny handful that were not available until later. But there may be somebody who can set me straight on that.
Yeah, most of these texts flooded in after the fall of Byzantium, so they...
Yeah. Puck, did you have a different question?
No, I did not. I was about to repeat Ernesto's question.
Cool.
I had a question. I just wanted to go back really quick to the word habit, because Aristotle points out that habit, or doing something out of what we call habit today, repetition for the sake of repetition, apparently non-virtuous. So I'm wondering, like, how that accords with this.
Okay, so the way Aristotle views habit is that it is what you're doing is you're cultivating a virtuous state in yourself, so that you just come to the point that that's how you behave. You just behave virtually because you've inculcated it into yourself over so much time, repeatedly. So from a modern point of view, if we do things out of habit, what Aristotle is talking about is good habit, virtuous habit. But for him, habit is a disposition of capacities that you then purposely cultivate in a virtuous manner to frequently, consistently result in virtuous actions.
Okay. So that conscious, intentional employment of these principles is sort of the key element there.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Because habit can't be built without prudence.
So let me ask you this way. When I'm fighting at speed, a lot of times I'm not thinking things through, I'm doing a reflex.
Right.
If I've inculcated a good reflex as a habit that follows
Correct.
the principles, is that virtuous, or is that?
That would be virtuous according to this text. As far as I understand, we got to remember that this is all my perception, and clearly I have definite leaks for flaws.
I think you're on the right track.
Wouldn't its virtue depend on its prudence, i.e., does it arrive at the desired goal? Because if that reflex causes you to get hit because you weren't consciously applying prudence, then it would not necessarily be virtuous, right?
It ends
First
up being
principles.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're right. First principles help make sure that your reflex for that particular situation will be the correct one.
Yeah.
So it's this interlocking of stuff. And Chris makes a good point. The end goal is what tells you what to do. If your end goal is, I don't want to die, and you inculcate habits and actions that support that conclusion, that particular practical syllogism action conclusion, then you can safely rely on your built-up habit being virtuous and safe. That said, there's still a judgment call happening in the moment. There's still judgment calls that have to happen in the moment, because sometimes a situation will come up that you are not familiar with. So you have to rely on episteme and wisdom. So episteme, wisdom is where scientific knowledge, where justified true belief and intellect meet. So you have to get wisdom to then interact with prudence. And you have to do it in the moment. But if you've inculcated a good habit, that process doesn't take as long. And you can rely on prudent actions that are habitual to give you the space and time to make decisions on the fly.
Can I add a little piece to that? Eudemio, one of the characters asks Charilao at one point, how could you possibly think about all this? Because he goes into geometry and Euclid and all this sort of thing. And how could I possibly think about all this stuff while I'm fighting? And Charilao says, well, do you think about walking? Do you think about these sort of things? You've created habits based on principles. And you don't rely on knowing exactly what sort of things are coming at you. You rely on your habit, which creates prudent action in the moment. And so one of Carranza's big criticisms is this notion of, well, when your opponent does this, do that. When your opponent does that, do this. And he says, no,
Exactly.
that's nonsense. Because then you're counting on your opponent to tell you what to do. You must act on universal principles that become habit.
Yeah. And in fact, that very principle that you said, you can't rely on your opponent to tell you what to do. is called out explicitly in the second dialogue. It's called out explicitly. Any technique, any treta that relies on your opponent doing a particular thing is automatically false. Okay. So I don't quite feel so bad right now. I feel like other people's brains are bubbling, and that makes me feel a tiny bit better. So if we're ready to continue, does anybody else have any more questions, or are we ready to continue? I'm going to take that as a ready to continue. We're going to hit this word that makes me want to cry, and it's medio. Because medio, the word medio in Spanish can stand in for medium, measure, middle, or means, or the mean. So when seeing these phrases, you know, it's like, para que el diestro sepa poner el cuerpo en el medio, you know. So the diestro knows how to place their body in the middle. Well, are we shorthanding virtual middle here? Are we talking about the golden mean? Like, you know, when we say middle, are we talking about like a dogmatic middle? We're talking about the appropriate middle for the situation, right? How do I translate that cleanly? How do I translate that in such a way that the English language reader is going to understand what's going on? No, seriously, if somebody has any ideas, tell me. So we come to this incredibly weighted word, and we also have to take into account the possibility that Carranza is relying on multiple meanings at one point. He's a smart man. And we already know from above that he's quite happy to throw a double entendre to get a message across. Yeah, I agree with Puck. I think I might do the same thing and just leave it as medio, and then, you know, have a good, nice explanation of medio in the intro or in a glossary, because anyway, so here we have, you know, so that the diestro knows to put the body in the middle, and to know, conocer, conozca, to know, not recognize. I would, here, let me just do a little change here while I'm here, right? Because I'm here. No, that's no. There we go. Anyway, so that they know the posture of proportion, and with it they gain the grades, the degrees to the extremes that the opponent might be putting themselves into. Yeah, that's the trick. Sometimes I don't know how to pick the contextually appropriate term. Sometimes I'm like, well, it could be X or Y. They both fit here. They have slightly different meanings, but they both make sense. Help! Usually what I do in that case is, if I come to something like that, I'll put a footnote and I'll say, I chose this definition. I chose to use this term, but this other option could be completely legit, and I leave it here for you to take a look at and make your decision. So let's see. Oh, here's a fun place where I screwed up a transcription. That changes everything, right? Con should be son. So con is with, son is. It's a being verb. So from here, we will learn the extremes of longitude. We will learn that the extremes of longitude are high and low, not with high and low. It's are high and low. It's a distinction. Some people might argue it's not that big of a distinction. I personally feel it is. Anyway. So here we start talking about, you know, movements of the body. We start talking about postures. We start talking about the angles that the sword can hold, and the movements that you make in response or in relation to the movements that the opponents make. And now we're beginning to call on geometry as first principle. So extremes of motion that you can make are backwards and forwards, and these also serve for the increase and decrease of movements, or the body itself can just make these actions by dilating or contracting the space. And the interesting thing here is that the person who responds is Meliso, and he's the mathematician. So he brings up a problem that all of us talk about. I can't tell you how many times I see people asking this question in HEMA groups and in and even in the SCA, and like Puck's written a blog about it. It's, how do we take this geometric understanding and how you should be holding yourself and doing things when every human being is built differently? How do we take this into account? What do we do? And he then sort of digests what Charilao has said, and then says, so knowing all of these things that you've said and knowing that bodies are different sizes, it seems to me that there are no precise rules when it comes to fencing. There are no precise rules. Plain old wisdom, which is scientific knowledge and intellect, cannot work by itself here, because wisdom is something that can be applied to crafts, which is an action that brings about a product. And those tend to be dogmatic and repeatable. Like when you build a house, there are certain ways that you build a house. When you throw a pot, there are certain ways that you throw the pot, or else it's not going to work. And the argument here is that you cannot just rely on wisdom. It's not going to work. You need to be recognizing the particulars of a situation. So when we say something like we adjust for causes, it's sort of one of our joke phrases now. That's absolutely true, but it goes so much deeper than that. And then here we start bringing the idea of inequality. And this is a concept that I do feel is important in this thesis, and I'm still getting my brain around it. I feel like I intuitively understand it, but I can't explicitly explain it to somebody else, which means I need to go looking into my own thought process to see where I can fix that. Because we should never say just because. That's not how we teach. Certainly not Destreza. We don't say just because. Here he says, pues de la proporción de la menor desigualdad no sigue acto. So from the proportion of the least inequality, an act doesn't follow. And if you think about a pan balance, and you think about two equal weights, I mean, it can be, it can be adjusted a little higher, a little lower, but if you have, no, I take that back. If you just have a pan balance with two equal weights, it's not going to go anywhere. If you take away a weight, you get action. If you put a weight down, you get action. But if they're both equal, nothing's happening. Yeah. And then we come here to a term that's really messing with my head, because as far as I understand things, the tretas particulares, the particular techniques, are attacks, heridas. The word herida means to wound, and it can be commonly used as a verb in Spanish. But here he's talking about universal attacks. And I sort of had to struggle with it, and I'm still not sure I've got this right. I think he may actually be talking about the order evinced in universal shared qualities of attacks. These qualities can't be countered by the shortness or the tallness of the fencer, or by the size and length of a weapon. The qualities of these attacks can only be countered by opposing angles. And then here we come into a bit of categories again, where because the whys of the whole are the same as the whys of the parts, it doesn't matter what size of weapon you're using. It doesn't matter, the actual length dimensions of the weapon don't matter. What matters is the angles in which you hold them. And then the word género comes here. When Aristotle is talking about particulars and universals, particulars are the moment in time that you're in, that you're experiencing. And universal is this broad body of knowledge that exists that you've established through truth. And in between are these generalizations that you can make. So we're very accustomed to biological taxonomy, where each layer, each over category gets its own name. Like you got species, genus, family, order, class. For Aristotle, it doesn't really matter. There can be any number of subcategories between universal and particular. What matters is your universal and your particular, and then these general things in the middle. And the thing that struck me about thinking about that is that I wonder if that's why the general techniques are called general, because they're what gets you between the particular attacks and the universal defenses, and from the universal defenses to the particular attacks. That's something my brain's been playing with. I now give it to you to play with. Anyway. Again, another call to geometry, and now we're starting to talk about the right angle. We're beginning to break down that it doesn't matter what weapon you use. There are universal methods of affecting an offense or affecting a threat. And the way to do that is to use the angle that is longer than all the rest. And it is between the strength and the weakness, which here, and I find this incredibly interesting. He claims that the obtuse angle is the weakest, which I kind of see, because if your sword's like here, you're not protecting anything. But he says the strongest angle is the acute. And I'm still struggling with that. I'm not sure how to tackle that. But in between the strongest and the weakest, you've got the right angle, the angle that's straight out. And then here he says the universal technique is regulated against the strongest posture of the body, which is considered to be upright, and against the longest posture of the sword. So the universal technique is at the right angle. Is it things that come out of the right angle? But when he talks about the longest posture of the sword, he talks about it being the longest posture, the longest length of whatever weapon it is, regardless of the height of the body. Yeah, Brent, I think you may be right. I think the idea that all weapons can perform thrusts and perform circular actions, I think that's a good way to go, and I'll try to remember that.
Lois, since you're pausing just for a moment, I've pulled out Mary's notes on the book, and I'm sort of following along.
Yeah.
I have a note on strength of obtuse and weakness, and from the right angle in order to move into obtuse.
Yeah.
You have to lift, which is violent, and you descend into
Right.
acute, which is natural power. So
That makes sense.
my guess, reading
That
it,
makes
was
sense.
that it was the vector motion being powerful or weak.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. And that just goes to show, I'm not seeing all of these things because it's just so very much. It's, it's kind of like going into your storage closet to grab your winter coat and then everything falls out. The surfboard, the sewing machine, the ironing board, and you have to figure things out. But that makes a lot of sense.
Figueredo mentions this in terms of natural and violent movements, right? But you end up in one of those positions. So the natural movement starts weak and ends strong, and the violent movement starts strong and ends weak.
Yeah.
I think another point that Carranza or Carilao makes is that even though someone may be taller than you, have a longer weapon than you, their actions may be inherently weak. And if you can judge those actions, and if you can judge their medio de proporción, if they are at the wrong distance and at the wrong angle, you can exploit all of those things to your advantage, so that even though you may appear to be at a disadvantage by simply measuring the two opponents, that's not necessarily true.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. Okay. Okay, so this is one of those things that doesn't like it's not, oh look, more Aristotle. This is me seeing in the text and seeing confirmation that we cannot live in right angle. We cannot. This statement calls back onto the concept of inequality. A balance that is balanced doesn't move, it's static. You need an inequality to give that momentum, to give that impetus to the action that you then choose to make. So it says, you do well to consider that the body will perform a technique more easily when the body is not in the middle. And there I've got a question about my own translation, because it says en medio. And that could mean, you know, it's in medio. You know, in middle, mean, this is where it starts getting confusing, and I've been thinking about this way too much, so I'm thinking in circles. But you do well to consider that the body will perform a technique more easily when the body is not in the middle, nor when the sword and the arm are in the longest posture. So right there, we've called out the right angle. The body will perform that the body will perform a technique when it is not in right angle. It is better to be in a weak angle with the body in one of the extremes it can have. And then this phrase is magnificent, and I will never really properly translate it into English, because the grammar of the Spanish, the verbs do a lot of the heavy lifting here. Porque quien pudo lo más, podrá lo menos. The one who could do the most will be able to do the least. So if you have yourself in a position with a lot of potential, a lot of different various potentials, then your actions will be commensurately smaller, or they will be commensurately weaker. You won't actually be able to put your energy into effect as well as you could if you were out of that middle position. Anyone have questions or comments about that?
Maybe quien pudo, the one who was able to do the most, because it implies action, not could do the most, but did the most. Pudo, right? Preterite, implying did the most. Not quien podía lo más.
Yeah.
But quien pudo.
There's a connection between pudo and podrá that's
Did
making me feel like it's an aphorism. But no, you're right. It's worth looking into, because the one who did the most can do the least. And that changes the meaning of the phrase, and it's definitely worth thinking about. Was that what you were pointing out? Was that the thing you were pointing to?
Just that could do makes it sound like podía or podría.
Yeah.
Whereas pudo is an action done, finished.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah. I can't outline that because I've got so much highlighting there. That's okay. Let's see.
But yeah, you're right. It's tough. Many of these are really, really tough. Not that I've tried translating, but.
Just looking at that phrase that comes immediately before, like the first half of that, it makes me think more of that. I think it was it the Heverin lecture that was talking about the distinction between reactive fencing versus, being in a position of potential where that neutrality, that medio, gives you many options to react from. But at some point, you have to commit. And you don't have you can't have that executive action unless you commit. You have to take yourself into some at least some greater degree of extreme. And that seems to follow from the paragraph,
Yeah.
first half of that paragraph.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. This is why crowdsourcing work can be so good. And by crowdsourcing, I mean like relying on a brain trust. And this is the first time we see the word proposition come up in this context. These propositions, these statements that assert things, know that they're not particularly applied to the sword alone, but instead universally to every single weapon that there is, by decreasing and increasing movement and changing the endpoints. Términos, I feel here is probably endpoint, according to the medio de proporción that each one has. There ends up through this text being a lot of retreading of arguments. And because my brain is just so burned out from looking at this text, I don't have the space I need to see if the retreading brings up anything new or brings up a contrast or brings up a comparison. I suspect that probably is the case, because otherwise, why would Pacheco have kept the text? But so Eudemio says, this is really difficult for me because these terms are really new. Talk to me a little bit about strength. Maybe I can understand that a bit better. And Carilao says, well, the cause of your difficulties is, as you say, and here I've translated it as lacking knowledge of the fundamentals of the art, but knowing what I know now, por carecer de los fundamentos del arte, I actually think Carranza is saying you're having a hard time with all of this because you're not familiar enough with the first principles that relate to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that art does not mean creativity. It means technique.
Right, exactly. It means a body of knowledge.
Yeah.
So then he starts talking about how will and intent are shaped. So he talks about know that will, intent, here he calls it strength, fuerza, force, has its origin in the brain, where animal virtue is housed, and it's diffused through the nerves and the muscles, which each have their limit, and they've got their terminus, like other finite things, which is something that Destreza has to take into account. The edges of things, because the edges of your opponent are what you want to hit. The edges of your opponent's weapon, like the extremities of the weapon, are what you want to be controlling. Oof. So, yeah, some of these are corrections for myself, but Carranza is making the argument that once you have used your senses, once you've used your aestheses to appraise your opponent, you apply your attack according to that appraisal. Because any movement, no matter what kind it is, can be constrained or restrained with another lighter movement, leaving in reserve some strength or energy to exit the strike. I feel like this is a major argument against lunges. Because he wants you to reasonably and virtuously proportion the energy that you put into an aggressive movement to give you enough energy to competently protect yourself on the way out, whether the strike hits or not. That's a long note. Let's look at the whole note. Here's one of those terms that I've struggled with, Brent, reparo. It can mean parry, but reparo has more of an implication of like returning, of like coming back. Do you have any feeling about that?
First of all, any comment I made or will make is from the perspective of a person who has zero experience in actual swordplay. I'm purely an academic editing this Spanish text. So I'm a philologist, not a sword fighter. But reparo, is the means of countering. I would call it counter.
Yeah, the word counter is dangerous, and we're going to find that out later.
Okay.
But
See, I don't. That's where I don't know where I'm getting into dangerous territory, right? In
No,
terms
that's the
of
thing.
confusing
Well, I
people.
mean-
But yeah, the notion is to deviate and then come back.
yeah.
Right?
So the
That's
interesting
the
thing is,
impression I get.
yeah, and apparently I agreed with you because I had countered here too. But I remember coming back and changing that because later in the text, Carranza makes the argument that there's no such thing as a counter to a technique because Destreza techniques are all true, and you can't counter a truth with a truth. Syllogisms don't work that way. So he says it's not the techniques themselves that counter each other, it's the qualities of the techniques that counter each other. So you can counter a straight line with a curved line, and you can counter a curved line with a straight line. That's why the word counter is loaded.
Yeah.
So
Lois?
That has
Yeah.
some amazing implications. I mean, just thinking about what you just said there, that's like there. It almost seems like there should be a whole lecture on just that idea. I mean, that's like some next level Jedi stuff right there.
Yeah. I think that's super key to notice that Carranza is always talking about, I mean, even when he in the third dialogue, when he starts really getting into the geometry and so on, he's still talking about universal principles. He's not trying to create this sort of, if he does this, do that, or you should do this and then do that kind
Yeah.
of thing. No, he's really never does that. So he never meant this book to be kind of an instruction manual in that kind of way.
yeah,
That's the impression I get anyways.
yeah, you're
think
absolutely
maybe-
right.
Maybe that's why it did so poorly. I mean, honestly, it was never re-edited, in its original form.
Yeah.
Who knows how bad it was. He was mocked in his time in some ways by certain classes anyways, for being just
Well,
inaccessible.
he comforted himself by looking at the classes that mocked him and went, I don't care.
Who cares?
But yeah, I've relied a bit on Dr. Curtis's dissertation for some, historical background and filling in and things like that. And yeah, it's interesting because what you bring up about, he's very insistent that this is all about teaching you how to think in the moment. It's not about if X, do Y. No, think for yourself, for crying out loud. I can just see him like an old Sephardic grandfather, and he was never Sephardic, but I can just see him as like, no, think for yourself for a moment. No, come on, you know how to do this. Don't be an animal, Yeah.
This is also interesting. This is also interesting in sort of contrast to the Italian tradition of the era, which pedagogically is very like counter structured. Like you have a 1, 2, 3, and a 4, and each of those, if they do this, you do that, and it's there's a lot of crossover. But from what you're saying now, I'm starting to really see that like Destreza really is a totally just different thing if you start looking at it on this level, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, like there are first principles that will tell you the safest structures to use. So there are certain things that you're not going to do unless that extreme is called for in a particular situation. Ernesto's asked a question, but it didn't fit in the little window thingy. Can somebody please read that to me?
Yeah, one
Possibly
moment.
coming from left field here, but I can't help but wonder if his concern of overcommitting may be impacted by his time as a military commander in the field.
I would say that makes total sense. Like it's difficult enough when you're a single human being operating against another single human being, but when you're managing units, they move more slowly. They take longer to control. They take longer to change direction. Yeah, I think that's legit. I think that's a totally legit speculation. Yeah.
But his major actions in the field were after writing the book.
Mm.
So Not that he didn't have experience in the field, I don't know, but
Yeah.
to my knowledge, most of that experience, like in Portugal and so on, was
Yeah.
post-work.
But it could still be a language that he's familiar with. And
Yeah.
referencing. Lois, I had a question about
Yeah.
reparo. It's used as repair also, isn't it? I mean, in that same sense.
Mhm. And it can also mean it can also be used as retreat. Like I'm going to repair to my house. Like we even have an English equivalent that's uncommon but is still technically correct.
Right.
But yeah, it can mean to repair. It can mean to, I'm going to repair back to my house for evening drinks.
So the root of that is comes from prepare, doesn't it? It's like re-prepare. So depending on whether it's a transitive or intransitive verb, you're either like fixing something or fixing a situation or getting ready for something else. So it's got that
Yeah.
counter, not in terms of like countering this action, but there's an implied response for a lot of it, right? Because there's something to follow. It implies there's something that follows.
Yeah. It's worth looking into more deeply because I agree. I think there's a lot happening in the word reparo that we're not necessarily recognizing, and it's worth getting a better handle on it. So this is just me. This is my own personal observation. I've seen the word desvío and reparo come up and sort of be contrasted against each other. Not directly, but I've just looked at the way that the words are approached. And desvío is where, and it's described later in this text. Desvío means to let the opponent's thrust keep coming, but with your blade, you make its target false. You take the point away from its true target and you put it elsewhere where it's safe for you. A reparo actually stops an action. So like if somebody were cutting at me, I would personally throw an atajo on it. But as an aside, the word atajo in this text only shows up once in the context of sword actions, and it is not defined. It shows up in a list of sword actions late in the fourth dialogue. Most of the time, the word atajo, when it shows up in this text, and I actually checked through the full Carranza text, not just this Compendio. Most of the time when the word atajo shows up, it means to vocally interrupt. So like if John were talking and all of a sudden I said, well, anyway, that's an atajo. Estoy atajando. And then it shows up in a slightly different sense where the maestro is bragging about himself, saying, oh, somebody tried to jump me in the streets, but I showed them what, and they ran away, and so I started chasing them down, shortcutting through streets of, Seville, atajando por las calles. Those are the senses that we see the most, and mainly it's the vocal interruption. The only time we see the word atajo, it's listed in a bunch of other sword actions, but it's never defined. So when it comes to the word reparo, are we actually seeing something like, oh, okay, cool. Thank you, Puck. I'll have to take a look. What I'm wondering is when we see the word reparo, should we be thinking proto-atajo? I don't know. Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway. Complicated word.
Folio 16 verso talks about like tajo gets used a lot, right?
Yes.
As opposed to atajo. Now, again, I don't have experience, but on Folio 16 verso, he says, y los movimientos que consiguen la herida en la destreza son tajo, revés, estocada, o acometimiento. Yeah. So tajo is actually thought of as a way of achieving herida, right?
Yeah.
In some context. So controlling the opponent's blade for the purpose of creating a wound.
Yes. To give you some fencing context around that, tajo and revés actually come from beyond destreza into the from the vulgar style, the style that existed before Carranza wrote this work. And tajo means a forehand cut, and revés means a backhand cut.
Okay.
I'm doing a bit of a disservice, but that's the simplest way to say it.
Okay.
So whenever you see the word tajo, that's what it means. It's a forehand approach. And you're right, the tajo can be to strike the opponent, or it can be used to control the weapon.
Okay.
And now I'm getting into fuzzy understandings, so I could be wrong. Somebody may need to step in and clarify things for me here. But my understanding is, like in Godinho, if you use a tajo to clear out an opponent's weapon, you're actually clearing it out. That's more of a beat as opposed to a contact control. And the atajo that we understand out of Pacheco is it's a continuous opposition. So, instead of being that, it's that.
Yeah.
If fingers can be of any use in this explanation.
Yeah, that's the impression I get, certainly from the third dialogue.
Yeah.
This notion of when he talks about the strength of the blade along the length of the blade and controlling the weak part of your opponent's blade with the strong part of your blade.
Yeah.
That comes in there.
Yeah, that's a fundamental concept for people who study this. Destreza is that idea of knowing where the strong of your blade is and where the weak of your blade is, and where it is on the opponent's blade, and how you want to manipulate that for whatever other ends you're seeking to achieve.
I don't want to belabor the point.
No, that's all right. I love word talk. It makes me happy. Anyway. Okay. So this particular passage is about measuring the effort that you put in so that you don't put in everything. You need to have some energy left for you to get back out. And here he talks about the order in which these things should happen. So when you strike, your movement should be lighter than the opponent's, and you should have some strength left in you so that you can then safely come out. And at the end of your exit should be the start of the reparo, the counter, the response, the parry. So yeah, there's a lot there. I still need to do a lot of thinking about it. Let's see, there's my arrow. Okay. So here, Carranza is talking about how movements can fail. And two ways that a move can fail is when it starts too late, or when the movement doesn't have a cause or a why to support it. So if you take an action with your sword and you're trying to defend yourself, and it is a considered action, it's got a why behind it. If you're too slow, I can't stop the attack that comes in and I get hit. Or even if I started at the right time, I just move my sword without any why behind it, without any good structured why behind it based in first principles, it's pointless, because it won't have any effect. Everything will be out of proportion. So the act is lost. But then Charilao argues that Destreza will teach you how not to do that. It shows you how to, it says guardar el aliento, which basically means protect your breath. Basically, it's not getting out of breath. It's preserving your energy and conserving your strength instead of, just wasting all your strength trying to hit the person. And it encodes all of this in the declaration of the profiles of the body. Actually, Brent, you bring up a good point in your comment. I have not seen any published version of Filosofía de las Armas that is earlier than 1618. And I feel like that glossary is potentially suspect. I feel like the glossary could have been
1618?
Yeah, the version I have is 1618. It comes out of the National Library of France. It's the only PDF version, PDF scan
Oh,
of
okay. Well, I can
Filosofía de
see
las Armas.
there's the original one from 1580.
I had. Can you confirm that the original from 1580 has the glossary in it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
that's the one I'm quoting here. Is the
Wonderful. Okay, that's actually super useful
That's the
information. Thank
text
you so much for that.
I'm using, is the 1580 text.
That's brilliant.
Originally,
Okay.
the permissions were given in 1569 for the publication, but
Yeah.
for reasons that we don't know, that publication was delayed
Yeah.
till 1580. So it's definitely some editing happened between 1569 and 1580, but 1580
Yeah.
is the earliest physical thing we have.
Right. And
I
I've
think-
never been able to find a PDF of that version.
Okay.
I think
I'll
we have
send you-
multiple copies of the Carranza text. Let me see. Talk to Mary and see what we've got.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of collecting references. I mean, like, where are they, right? There's only, that I'm aware of, 6 that I've found in existence, but there may be others in private collections and,
Yeah.
London Library, that kind of thing. But
No, the main thing I wanted to confirm was whether or not that glossary was an addition by Pacheco or somebody else well after the fact, as opposed to something that would have been originally included by Carranza. That's
yeah,
the
now
thing I
it
wanted
is,
to confirm.
just to be clear, it is foliated separately. So it is not from the same set of gatherings. It's
Yeah.
definitely foliated separately. So I'm sorry for non-philologists. Basically, it just means that the main part of the text was planned out as a unit. And then this was planned out separately on a separate set of gatherings. Now, that does not mean, of course, it's still the font and the typeset and everything used appears to be the same. So although it was bound, or you could bind it separately, it was bound with the original. And the copies that I have, the PDF copies that I don't know about you, Puck, but the PDF copies that I have 4 now, and they all include the glossary.
Cool. Okay.
Although the initial, the first parts, the sort of preliminaries are somewhat different in some cases. Some are eliminated or they switch order, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Thank you for that. That was actually really helpful for me. I appreciate that. Okay. So, coming back to this statement here, we're relying on de anima. Charilo is beginning to outline how the faculties, how the rational faculties of the human being cooperate with observing the profiles of the opponent, to give them the information to then do what they need to do. And it's a litany, and it's a bit weird, but it follows that Aristotelian mapping of human conception. So compiling all of the Destreza and the declaration of the profiles of the body, giving the will, animo, what is most convenient for this evaluation, what is most expedient. I'd probably pick the word expedient there. What is most expedient for this evaluation, for this ministry, which should have the facility to understand, comprender. That's a different kind of understand. Memoria para guardar, memory to save. Memory is a big component in learning. It's a big component in the process of experience. So you take in information through your senses and it gets processed in memory, so that once you have a number of different interactions with a similar thing, you have a bunch of different experiences with a similar thing. Like, you learn to recognize a horse because it is built in a particular way. Then memory will let that become learned information for you. So memory to save information for the future. Prudence. Prudence appears for the first time in this text. Prudence to prevent, for the prevention or avoidance of problems. The use of many propositions. Propositions, statements that assert something, to apply them in a way that will most cancel out, or that will best match the affect or impetus of the person that you're seeing. And then having this knowledge, conocimiento, of, oh no, and this, oh no, I missed my page. Yeah, this knowledge of the opponent. Oh, if I click on footnotes, they work. That's what messed me up. All right. Having this knowledge of the opponent by his color. When we talk about color, we're talking about, like, you know, is somebody phlegmatic, choleric? That's the thing we're talking about. And their and their build, their actions, their movements, and the complexions also goes right back to choleric, phlegmatic, and which ones they have the most of. Then the diestro can apply, according to all of this information, the thing that is the best thing to do. And he makes this claim. I don't know how important this is, but I think it's good to remind ourselves that it is important to really take in the opponent as they're moving, because without difficulty, we can know in human beings the interior properties of the soul through the exterior signals of the body. So if somebody's mad, you can tell they're mad. That's what's being said here. I think that relies on old science.
I think
Yeah.
there's a certain amount of very old science here, that the notion that you know a person by their external appearance, you know, this kind of, it's based on the humors and this notion that all internal things manifest in the external body, and just not, you know, sort of, it's pretty, it's early modern science, right? But
there's another beautiful instance of this early modern science where Pacheco's Carranza's explaining why a dagger is all strong, and it has to do with parallax, but it only works when parallax is operating according to the old rules of light, which is visual rays would come out of your eye and bounce off an object to come up to come back, and that is how you saw. That was the process of sight. And it's very cool because it, you know, it's one of those things that demonstrates a valid argument that is still false, because it's relying on information that is not true, but it still comes to the correct conclusion, which is super cool to see. And a great way to practice your syllogisms if you're very, very rusty at them like me. So I saw some questions pop up in chat. Huck, do you want to bring those forward?
Well, we have a question from Aristotle. Would color work for a modern reader instead of color? But I'm not sure that the humors
no.
are really a modern thing.
No, color. In this case, you know, color of the face. It's about your. It's color and colérico are not related.
I think Mary used complexions here.
Yeah, and he says color, and then he uses complexions in the same sentence. So
no, you're right. She translated as color and physiognomy.
Yeah,
but that use of synonyms in the same sentence is not unusual for the period either. You know, that sort of repetition of ideas.
Yeah. Is it kind of way to reinforce the idea? It's a way of saying, like, this and this. Is it?
Yeah, it's I think, and he's talking here about reading your opponent's mood. You know, are they? Yeah, like you said, are they really angry? Are they cool? You know, you're going to treat these opponents differently.
Yeah. Okay. So here in this particular paragraph, we start talking about prudence and its operation. When you make a decision, there is either Aristotle claims it's slow, but I think if you have your habits well formed, the deliberation can be very quick. Deliberation is where you take the truth of what you know, that you know is true, and then you take your collective experience about a situation, and then you take the actual facts that are happening in the situation, and then using prudence to process all of that information, you choose the correct action. So it's important to see the word confiriendo, because I really feel like that's calling back to deliberation, to the concept of deliberation that's supposed to happen quickly in your head. I know a lot of HEMA talk makes a big deal about the OODA loop, but this is honestly, it's just one more emanation of the concept of the OODA loop.
Sorry, what does that mean?
Observe. It's either orient, observe, decide, act. Yeah.
Okay.
Orient,
It's an
observe.
acronym.
Yeah. Orient, observe, decide, act. It came from I think he was with the Air Force, an Air Force major general in the U.S. As he was trying to find more expedient ways of training fighter pilots. It's like, don't sit there and deliberate about what's the right thing to do. You have this knowledge that's internalized in you. Use this cycle. You orient, you observe, you decide on what you're going to do, and then you do the thing that you've decided to do. And that's sort of what's happening here. So let's see. I know Chris keeps saying stuff in chat, but before I forget, I just want to thank him specifically because he's been incredibly patient with me just being like, I found this, duh! And then he'll say things like, oh, I kind of remember from the classes that I took back at uni. It reminds me of blah. And every time he'd come up with some key word, I'd be like, oh, and it would be a new rabbit hole that would then lead me to a bunch of other stuff in here. So without my conversations with him, this would be a much less deep presentation. So I wanted to make sure that I gave him a shout out, as the kids say. Okay. So we're barely on page 15 and it's already like an hour and a half in. So this particular passage to me is very interesting because he's talking about breaking the rules. He says, there are some responses to the opponent that will break the rule of, always being strong against weak or being weak against strong, and applying the best and safest angles. And some of these responses will have the virtue of 2 or 3 angles, which says to me, this is one of those times when instead of keeping your arm straight out, you actually, like, you're folding it in to protect yourself and come in for a conclusion. Your arm is in several different angles, but it has virtue because it's keeping you safe as you go about seeking the goal that you want. So even as he's giving you rules, he says there are some things that will break the rules and they'll do it and it'll be for a purpose. There is a virtue that these 2 or 3 angles have in the body and the arm and in the sword. Okay. Okay. So there's a bit more talking about these things until finally Odemio's like, okay, hang on. All right, Charilo, tell me something. Tell me something about what distance is in Destreza. So we actually get a very considered definition of what it is. It kind of like, I don't know. I never know what to think about this, but distance is the name for what is between 2 people. One, as they say, is in stance against the other. Or in other words, distance is the thing that is between the sword and the body, or between the sword and the sword, or between the foot and the foot, or between the body and the body, according to the different profiles, which should be measured by the eye to know what the remote extreme is in a posture. And then I had to retranslate something that apparently clarified this passage. So the original text reads in a way that I'm not going to read because it's unclear. But I will read. There we go. To know what is the remote extreme in a posture, and this measurement should be by lines with which the long or short distance is determined. And with these lines, it's understood what is geometry. So that's a call out to a first principle. It's understood what is geometry and what is mathematical proof. A demonstration is the key to securing true knowledge, true information. And a proof or a demonstration is a syllogism. So it's understood what is geometry and what is mathematical proof, the latter coming to make true the technique which is composed of these principles, so much so that this cannot be absent according to the terminus, which is the ends, which is what the ends of a thing are called. And then he starts talking about terminus like it's this really important point he wants to make you understand, but I don't know why. You know, he's like, you know, a terminus, the point is the terminus of a line. The line is the terminus of a surface. The surface is the terminus of a body. According to the philosophers, terminus is the place in which a proposition is resolved. And according to the perspectives, artists, the terminus is the completion of the visual lines on the horizon. But then he says, in Destreza, the terminus is the knowledge of the ends of the parts of the body or of the opponent's sword through which the various types of attacks should start, whether they're circular or straight, and shows you what type the angle should be that is made by the swords for a successful thrust, whether done in first or second intention. Through which the Destreza understands the order in which universal attacks are performed. With the conversation we've had already, I think I understand this phrase better. There are universal attacks, and those universal attacks are cuts, which include reverses, but circular cutting actions and thrusts, and one will follow another in particular ways. There's a good order to do them in, and then there's an order that is not as beneficial to you.
I think it's worth saying that Carranza often just goes off on little things to show how much he knows.
Yeah, I think there's a reason
Show
Pacheco
off.
only kept 33% of this text. I mean, I didn't really talk about the prologue here, but in the prologue, Pacheco, talking himself up like only he can, says specifically that what he's done with this text is retain only those things that are relevant to swords. So
It almost sounds like the way the examples that he used to build up to terminus before he starts talking about the Destreza application, it's almost sounds like he's saying you have to already know the end before you can commit to the beginning. Like the commitment to the beginning of the action must be derived by understanding all of the nuanced variables that go into arriving at the desired end point.
Although terminus here doesn't mean end in the sense of goal. It means the end of where things are. Like, I think, right? Where the sword is, the end of your arm, that kind of, I don't think he means termino, and in Spanish doesn't mean propósito. It doesn't mean objetivo. It doesn't mean, I don't think really.
Mary has a note here, which may be useful, but it's from the OED. And it says here, because they limit a proposition and be the uttermost parts or bounds whereunto any proposition is to be resolved. So in this case, it might be that terminus is the resolution of a proposition.
Okay, possibly.
So here's my thing. I think all three of you are right. And the reason here is later in this text, and I don't know where. I should have used even more colors to highlight my notes. There's the phrase where there's a phrase that paraphrased is what is first in intent is last in execution. So it supports all three of these approaches to the word termino, because I struggled with termino in looking at this. Like I just could not. He's making all of these metaphorical connections. I'm like, obviously it's important, otherwise he wouldn't spend time doing this. But I'm not grokking what he's giving me. But this discussion could have illuminated things for me and for other people. I'm going to have to watch this lecture over again just to hear what other people say. I think it's not going to stick in my head. Yeah, so this note basically covers what we just discussed. And just as you were saying about propositions and applying them, because once you know well the order, the diestro will always succeed, will always achieve their intention, their pretense, because through that they best know how to apply their propositions. So here's a little side note that's actually a bit older, and it's speculative on my part. But this is the first time I've seen anything that makes me think atajo. So for this, it's a benefit of the diestro to know which angle should follow each of the kinds of techniques to apply that angle in time against the opponent, against the part of their body that will best impede the movement of the opponent's attack. And the diestro can easily reform their own. To me, that sounds very much like at least how atajos show up when I'm trying to enact them. I don't do them well, but that's sort of the miasma that they emerge from. Does anybody else have any different ideas?
I think the second part of that statement where it says that it's not circular supports what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like they're in classical fencing, there are two types of defensive steel, right? Two types of parries. There is the direct parry where you move the blade in a straight line, and then there's the circular parry where you see like you would with the generals. And what he's saying here, it looks to me like he's talking about a straight parry.
And then here we have a bit more stuff that supports the idea of the atajo, because here we're talking about natural and violent movements and how weight is involved in operation of swords. And he says that this weight, combined with the nature of natural and violent movements, is the cause why, when you put one sword over another one and you put just a little pressure on the upper one against the lower one moves a very far distance. But he doesn't call it an atajo. He doesn't actually name it. And then here, through this part of the text, we start talking about movement. And I feel like we're all pretty safe in the idea of natural, violent, offline, aligning, accidental, and backwards. That I think we can gloss over this a tiny bit. Although you can see where I transcribed something wrong. It's those long S's. Man, they drive me nuts.
Very easy to do.
Here's a little thing that I think is incredibly interesting. There is a part, I think, in here where we see something like the consideration showing up. But here he actually talks about tempo, time. and he says that time, that which itself measures movement and the opponent makes incidentally. So I've taken accidente, I've taken accidental here to be closer to Aristotelian meaning, which is energy has to be put into the system to make it move. So the opponent has to have will that then puts impetus through the nerves and into the muscles to do the movement. It is not in their nature to be in motion at that time. So tempo, is the thing which itself measures movement and the opponent makes incidentally or intentionally. Not quite sure what to do with that. It's just a nice little nugget to play with and think about. We've talked about that. That's a bit on prudence. So here's where we start getting into some of that retreading of the argument. Here's talking about why prudence is important. The Destreza must first know things and then create in their understanding with the parts that have been declared earlier, what they should do against the opponent, which is the end, fin, not termino, fin, which is the end of Destreza. And then seek the measures that will give them that will give the desired intent. So right there, we've got that idea of virtues will give you the end, and prudence will give you the means to that end. And here it is. Here's that line I was saying, porque lo que es primero en la intención es lo último en la ejecución de la demostración. So what's first in the intention is the last in the execution of the demonstration. So if we're seeking to prove something, then it's the conclusion that we come up first, and then we start seeking the true, if you're being virtuous, the true premises that will support that conclusion.
Just a little thing, Lois. Fin can also mean the objective of something, right? It's not just the end in the sense of the
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, that's true.
El fin de algo is the objective of something, right? Why do you do something? Es el fin.
Can we go back to that passage, because that's always been a key passage for me, and I want to just share Mary's take on this, because it's from this paragraph that you've got here that I pulled out the Carranza Buddha loop, which was like know. And like apply the knowledge, then choose and act. So let me just read what Mary has here. Because the swordsman should first know, and after having known, to fabricate in the understanding with the declared parts what he should do against the adversary, which is the goal in the art of defense, and afterward to look for the means that are best to achieve the intention. Because what is first in the intention is last in the execution of the demonstration. It looks like we might have different versions of the original text. Maybe.
Potentially.
But I've always thought that was a really important piece.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, I didn't understand the feeling of that until I went, oh, it's a syllogism and propositions as action. Oh God, help. So it's a bit big for a t-shirt, but it might be a good one. And then when talking about demonstration, so demonstration is a syllogism. Demonstration is what gives you justified true belief. It's what gives you scientific knowledge, episteme. There are two kinds of demonstration. There's one by cause and one by effect. The demonstration by cause is generating up from first principles, and the one by effect is from experience. The one by effect is from experience. The thing is, the demonstration by effect is usually what we consider an inductive demonstration, and those are very, very rarely 100% true. They are good suppositions and probabilities of what may happen. But But this is where we start getting into the four causes. Meliso, our resident mathematician, steps in and says, we're talking about the causes. Let me talk to you about the causes. How familiar are we with the four causes? Do you want me to go over them? Sort of, a little, summarize them?
They're pretty key.
Yeah, I think a quick view of them would be helpful.
All right. I just want to see where this passage is.
Is the
Because
cake
there comes a
model.
point. Here we go. So we've got the efficient, we've got the final, the formal, and the material. So if we go back to where I was, the word cause can be a bit weighted because in modern thinking, a cause is an active reason for an effect. But in Aristotelian thinking, a cause is a why, and that it's the why for something, and that something can be physical or it can be an action. It was used for physical things like the cause of the softness of my shirt is the quality of the cotton and the weaving. And there are ways to categorize your causes. There are four aspects of reality that you need to really get a sense of the full whys of a thing. So Puck ages ago found a great video of a woman who used baking a cake to demonstrate the four causes. And it's pretty useful now. So instead of cause, you can sort of insert the word why. So there's a material why, there's a formal why, there's an efficient why, and there's a final why for a thing. So if you think about a cake, the material whys of a cake would be flour of some kind, a sweetener of some kind, a protein binder of some kind, and some kind of leavening, probably baking powder. I don't know. Something to make things fluffy and tasty when it's baked. We'll get to baking in a second. So we have those material whys. These are the ingredients of a cake. The formal cause, or the formal why, is it's on the surface, it's the shape that the thing has. But deeper, and the way that Aristotle thinks about it, the formal cause is the arrangement that makes a given thing that thing. Brief aside, when we talk about human beings, the material cause of a human being is the physical body, the meat. The formal cause of a human being is the soul. The soul and the body are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. That deeper meaning doesn't necessarily apply at this very second, but I just wanted to give you a sense of just how fundamental the concept of a formal cause can be. So the formal cause in a cake is that it will usually be square or round, and it's in layers, and it's got sweet gooey stuff between those layers. And the efficient cause is what brings the material into being in the arrangement that the form dictates. So the baker is an efficient cause. The equipment the baker uses is an efficient cause. The oven is an efficient cause. The heat is an efficient cause of the chemical reactions that occur to create the cake. And the final cause is the intention for the cake. It might be for a birthday. It might not be. It might be for like a Country Women's Association contest. At any rate, generally speaking, the end goal of a cake is to be eaten because it is delicious. So how are we feeling about the four causes or the four whys? Do we feel pretty comfortable with that? Okay. So Meliso takes the time to talk about how there are two interior causes, which are the material and the formal, which are of the thing. The cake, the material and the formal are the internal causes of the cake. The efficient and the final cause are exterior or extrinsic to the cake. They are not of the cake. And I suspect that this argument starts to happen here because he wants you to differentiate between essential and accidental qualities. And then there's a whole bunch of talk about variations on causes, which I don't understand them well enough to bring them to you in a way that will be useful. So we're just going to consciously omit that right now and carry on. Yeah, we'll come back to that one. Eudemio then asks if there's a difference between action and movement. And when we talk about act, we're talking about potential versus act. And to give an example of what that means, things that are in potential are things that could be, but they're not actually happening. So for instance, I have the capacity to speak Spanish, but it's currently in potential because I'm not speaking it now. If I started to speak it to you, then it would be in act. It would no longer be a thing that could be happening, and it would be a thing that is happening. So yeah, Puck's right. This is where we see the second intention being imported from rhetoric into fencing. I agree. So I was thinking that maybe that the first kind of action, which we call work, is a reference to techne, but it may not be. Techne is a thing that produces something. So a potter who's making a pot, or a house builder who's building a house. The other is the form that gives rise to a thing being what it is. So there's a potential that is enacted through form. So act and form end up kind of being the same thing, which is what Charilau is arguing here. And I kind of struggle with that, but I just kind of nod and continue. So let's see. So here's where we start seeing some of these really crunchy arguments showing up, right? So Eudemio says, okay, now that you've discussed the universal, and it's important to think about what universal means in this context, the universal parts of the Destreza, what is the material and form of the true skill? The Destreza has material and form, just like the syllogism has. So now we're applying the four causes to a syllogism, right? So the material is the axioms, the assumptions that compose it, and the true and false are not relevant to the material, but to the formal, because the formal cause is the disposition of the premises. So the material are the premises, and the conclusion is the formal. And I don't know why he jumps to this conclusion, but I just sort of nod and smile. He says, so, because we've said this, a technique must have four causes, without which no technique can be made. And he says, treta, treta technique. So the efficient cause makes sense. What brings the technique into being? Well, yeah, it would be the fencer, right? And the final cause, which is external, but the final cause of a technique is to defend or to strike. And then you defend yourself with the formal of the proposition, which I think means the conclusion of the syllogism, because the material of the Destreza are the movements, desvíos, reparos, parries, responses, lines, steps, and the medio proporcionado, the proportionate measure, which are the parts that compose the whole of the technique. And the formal is the disposition of these movements, steps, parries, and desvíos. Because a technique is nothing more than a proposition composed of different movements assembled to strike or defend. So a technique is nothing more than a proposition composed of different movements. So if we're taking the syllogism metaphor and pushing it, then a technique for you is one premise with your opponent supplying the other premise, with you aiming to make the conclusion the one that is true for you. In other words, protecting yourself or actually striking the person. Can you see why I was nearly in tears? Like there is so much crunchy stuff. My poor little brain. It is very fizzy. So Mike says he's not sure he's being metaphorical. Mike, would you like to talk a bit more about that? Or was that just an aside?
No, I think that this might or might not be important. First of all, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, and this goes back, I forget what they were called, but those syllogisms that resolve in an action
In an action?
rather than
Yeah,
a
it's a
proof.
practical syllogism. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that he means this quite literally, that a technique is a practical syllogism. And it's we go from the universal, we go from the scientific knowledge, which is about universal things, through general knowledge to its specific application in a particular case. So you can't see me nodding because I don't have a video on.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll nod for you. I'll nod
thank
for
you.
you.
You're doing very well. Thank you. I appreciate it. So I think that he really means that this is indeed a kind of a practical syllogism.
Okay.
Quite literally.
Cool.
So
Thank you.
Yeah, for what it's worth. I mean, I don't know if it really illuminates anything, but if it does, I don't know.
No, listen.
It struck me.
Any observation anybody has is going to be illuminating because this is all fresh and bubbly. Like this is not a prepared meal in any way. You're looking at the stew in mid-boil.
Okay. Time for the bay leaves. So okay.
Right? Yes, that's exactly.
Okay. Well, that's what I had there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so from that, Eudemio says, all right, so what do you say to the kinds of people, that will say that Destreza doesn't satisfy them because they're not going to pay attention to it, or because Destreza doesn't have counters, the vulgars give you counters. And here Eudemio definitely calls out the vulgar, saying, counters just exist to increase the number of techniques so they can charge for more classes and make bigger things. It's funny because Figueredo makes a similar complaint in his book. He's like, listen, I'm not going to give you a whole bunch of plays and like increase the page count of my book just to serve myself. No, you should be able to figure things out from the principles I'm going to give you. So here's where we get to that conversation where there is no such thing as a counter in Destreza. Carilao says, you should... Was somebody going to say something? Okay. You should know that the counters, that the vulgar names, are not in this art because all of the propositions are true, founded in dignities, which must be present. Dignidades has a number of different meanings, but there is a specific meaning about hierarchical structures that's somewhere in the middle of that there. And my personal feeling is that these dignities are referring to the layered premises that you build for your practical syllogism that leads to an action. And if you're doing Destreza, then you are working from first principles, which are true. And two true things together can never make a falsehood. That's not how syllogisms work. So, all of the propositions are true, founded in dignities, these dignities, which must be present. And he says, and tell me, what would the vulgars call the techniques that are made via the movements of the opponent? And Eudemio was like, well, those would be counters. And Carilao is like, no, they're not counters. They are techniques formed from movement. So in here, we talk about what is a formed technique. And the way that I understand it is treta formada, or a formed technique, is what you do that takes off from what the opponent is doing at you. And I think I may have mentioned this section is the closest I've seen yet to anything that talks about the considerations propio, apropiado, transferido. this conversation does not map perfectly, but I think, I think there's stuff in here that is useful. So Carranza says, let's not worry about the causes for the moment, because the cause doesn't emerge from the effect. And let's talk about the differences in form technique, some of which are formed in the first action of the opponent, and which have their own division, and others formed by perfect acometimientos. And if you're a newcomer to these lectures, I'm so sorry about acometimiento. So there's and here we talk about converting techniques. So there's techniques that you perform that are that end in a cut but start as a thrust, or start as a reverse and end in a cut, and they're universal. You can do them with any weapon. I feel like there's some historical material here that would explain why that's important, but anyway, go with Puck's definition of acometimiento for the purposes of this conversation. So the techniques formed from the opponent's attacks have their types. There's one when the intent of the intent of the opponent produces the first movement of a tajo, of a tajo. I got to be clear about that. A tajo. And we catch the beginning of that tajo from the opponent, and with that motion, we form the same tajo that they began, and we strike them with our own tajo. But the other is when, from the preparation of the opponent made for the tajo, we form reveses or thrusts. So there's one where, like, I kind of feel like the first form is apropiado, where we're attacking into their prep. No, sorry, is transferido, where we're attacking into their executive. And this next one is where it's propio, where we're attacking into their dispositive. But my brain.
Proprio is an attack in first intention.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is in the dispositive.
Thank you. Yeah. So apropiado is when you attack into the dispositive, and I think that's what's in this second paragraph. And transferido is when you attack into their executive, and that would be in this paragraph here.
This is also consistent with the Aristotelian concept of time, which is very specific and very different from what we think of as like clock time.
Yeah.
Which implies that before and after, according to Aristotle.
Yeah, unfortunately, Aristotle's conception of time is something that has fallen off of my mental desktop.
It's interesting in this context because it's also used a lot in the historical Italian tradition as relating specifically to movement. Like without movement, there is no time. Like if two people are at right angle and not moving, then there's no time. Nothing is happening. But it's specifically a measure of change and movement that makes it time. And the way Aristotle breaks it, I mean, there's a lot to it, but something worth digging more deeply into as it pertains to fencing.
I'm trying to remember. I read somewhere, and Carranza mentions this, the sort of relative position and how movement and time doesn't exist when movement is parallel, even though both objects may be moving. I'm trying to remember where he says it. Might be
I think it's later in this section. I think it may be later in this book, because my brain is like, I think I know what you're talking about. The interesting thing is, a little while ago, Greg Melee asked me to help out with a lecture of his, because he was talking about, he understood the conception of time for German fencing, and he understood the conception of time for Italian fencing, definitely, but he's like, I don't really have a good grasp on Spanish time. Can you help me out? And I'm like, yeah, sure. And I was in the middle of a bunch of this Aristotelian stuff. And I have a slide somewhere, and I'm not going to, well, maybe I can struggle to find it. I have a slide. No, that's not it. That talks about how the different styles view time. And the biggest difference between that I was able to identify between Italian and Spanish time is that the Spanish are not concerned with where you're going to be. They're concerned with where you are now. And the Italians are very concerned about the length of time that it takes for you to complete a thing. I can add that slide later on. I'm not going to struggle with it right now, unless people really want me to. So yeah,
that issue of length of time is the beginning of trying to describe
yeah,
discrete time and kind of finesse, like Aristotle, where big, longer times and shorter times are just times, right? They don't really have a measurement.
So here's where, and I can't believe I didn't highlight this, but here we go. So here's where Carranza's making his argument that there's no such thing as a counter, because he says the opposition of these movements that we call lines isn't in that they are lines, because the circular line, and that it's circular, we see that it's counter to the straight. So it's not, this line counters that line. It's this quality that counters that quality. And it's a known thing when it comes to arms that regardless of what kind they are, the circular is counter to the straight and the straight is counter to the circular. In this way, we determine that the curved line is not contrary to the straight line in its being a line, like a surface being black or white or rough or smooth. So here he's comparing things that aren't contrary to things that are contrary. Because a surface cannot be black and white at the same time. A fire, like a fire cannot be hot and cold at the same time. It can undergo change, which involves time, to become a different state, but it cannot be two contrary qualities at the same time. So all of this adds up to therefore, because the natural movement is of a nobler quality than the violent, it is superior whenever there is contact between swords. Because if lines were not contrary, according to the qualities of the movements of the sword, we would not be able to resist the violent movement with the natural movement as we do. And then there's, and in what you doubt that one proof contradicts that one proof. When we say proof, we're talking about a demonstration. We're talking about a syllogism. And in what you doubt that one syllogism contradicts another, being both true, and through some vector it seems to you that the proof no longer makes its effect because the other contradicts it. You fool yourself, because in Destreza, the lines that have a shorter distance to travel arrive first at the point the mover indicates than the ones that have longer to travel, and just because one arrives late does not mean it ceases to be true. So this is beginning to build into the point that Brent was talking about. And I believe it's here in this demonstration. And we'll put forth this proof, this demonstration, the syllogism, that one movement of the sword goes along the chord. So it's not the diameter that touches 2 points on a circle. It is another line that touches 2 points on a circle that is not the diameter. And another sword moves along the line of the arc. And another is a direct movement which begins at the chord and goes to stop on the arc. Which of these, to you, will seem to finish tracing their path first? And then Galileo says, the techniques in Destreza are the same kind. Destreza deals in propositions, and the contrary propositions that are in desvíos and pares lie in how desvíos take the point where the strike was going, impeding its attainment of its intended target, deviating the point to another, the act of which doesn't stop until the strike reaches the false destination. But cuts oppose thrusts, not because they are lines, but because one is a circular movement, or because one is in potential and the other in action, or because one is violent, the other natural, or one is offline and the other mixed. Because it's clear that if the opponent is in stance and makes a circular motion and the diestro makes a straight line motion, both of them toward the same point, the straight line, because it has less space to traverse, will arrive sooner than the circular. all of which you should understand. But if the circular movements were also violent, the straight movement would arrive even faster than the circular violent movement. So that's a very tangled, crunchy way of approaching. The qualities of the line are what will determine what happens. And you can have a true line, but if it starts from the wrong position or if it starts at the wrong time, it's not that the technique itself was false. It's just that you didn't continue the truth. You didn't extend the truth. You began from a false position. From here is where we start to go, yeah. It's funny that you say prudence, Puck, because exactly what's happening here is where we start to come back into the particular, and we start really talking about the senses and how they need to be processed to achieve the thing. And this is a really fun bit for me, because Galileo says, Eudemia says, all right, which senses are used most by those who perform the Destreza using science, who actually perform the science of the Destreza, the science of arms? And Galileo says there are two senses that always serve, although discussing them in particular, the objects of each one may serve to uncover other senses that are useful. So he's like, there are two really important ones, but when we talk about them and the things that they perceive, there may be others that show up. For me, though, I've already decided which of these two is the most prominent. And Polemarco, who I believe he's the lawyer, Polemarco says, well, all right, well, according to my understanding, which is the same as common opinion, sight serves best in the Destreza, because by looking at things, we come to understand the qualities that it has. And my opinion of sight is confirmed because by the object, because sight has as its objects color and light. The Destreza deals with the body where color and light will give you information. So sight has to be the most important. So we see Polemarco buying into this idea of, okay, let's syllogize the living daylights out of this stuff. Let me throw you a syllogism. And Galileo says, nah, it's not sight, it's touch. And then here's a phrase that I don't understand and I have not been able to break down: 4 active simple qualities. I did some research that kind of gave me an answer, but it didn't stick with me, and I'm not going to worry about finding it. So, Puck, do you mean I'm leaving out a lot of text, or do you mean that Pacheco left out a whole lot?
Pacheco's left out a whole lot of stuff here.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a big discussion about what an organ is, what vision deals with, and then we skip ahead to Chorilao's conclusion.
Yep.
So,
66% on the cutting room floor. So whatever the 4 active simple qualities are, they are what make touch the best. And we can try to determine what those qualities are in the responses that follow, but I haven't been able to really pick them up. So Polemarco's like, dude, touch can't distinguish between the strong and the weak. We know better. Between the strong and the weak, which is in the body of the opponent or in the posture of the sword, in the same way that sight can. I mean, come on. And Galileo's like, all right, buddy, let me show you. How can you distinguish the strong from the weak for the application of attacks and warn of strength and immediate potential according to what you find in the opponent, if not through touch? You know, strength is hidden. Strength is not an object of sight. Strength is an object of touch when you consider how the hand that squeezes the handle of the sword can then impart and receive pressures along the blade of the sword. And to confirm what we're discussing, know that virtue arises from the brain and travels through the nerves, and that the sense of touch is in the hand, by which the nerves can differentiate what they perceive. Because the sword is grasped tightly in the hand, it communicates the strength that it needs by means of the contiguous, because your hand is in contact with the sword and your sword is in contact with their sword. Having so conjoined in the medium this sense of touch and the measure applied to the sword, the strength of the opponent's weapon is easily determined. And then at one point, Polemarco also says, Carilao also says, sight alone is enough for what for what you're talking about, because strength never leaves the center in weakness. He talks about contraries, so let's set that aside. Here's the thing I was looking for. So Carilao says, well, sight is important, but it can't be completely important, because what happens if you're fighting at night? If you can't see the opponent and you can't see their sword, what are you going to do? And then interestingly, Melisso comes in. Melisso, the mathematician, sort of justifies both of their approaches. He says, hey, actually, so the theoretical, the higher intellectual, scientific knowledge parts of Destreza correspond to sight, because sight is the most spiritual sense and it's the most noble. And the practical parts we assign to touch, the practical, prudent parts we assign to touch, because it's inferior and it's subject as it is to any particular sense of the common sense. Very briefly, the term common sense in Aristotelian thinking is the faculty that takes in and synthesizes all of the information from all of the senses and gives us a full picture of whatever we're looking at. So like, I can sit here at my computer and I know that in addition to seeing my screen on and seeing my camera light on and seeing this microphone right next to my face, I can also feel the chair that is supporting me as I sit here. I can feel the cool air that's circulating through this room. I can hear the traffic outside a little bit. I can hear people typing. So the common sense is that faculty, that ephemeral thing that takes in all of this information and then gives you a full impression. So whenever you do in trivia, at the pub and somebody says, well, what does Carranza think is the most important sense in fencing? You know that it's touch and not sight. Right. So Carilao then makes a case for all the senses. He says, we can truly say that all of the faculties are useful to Destreza, because the most principal component of Destreza is in understanding. It's that nous, that intellectual faculty that allows us to synthesize everything. However, understanding is not not action. I can understand something but not be driven to act from that understanding. Action has to come from a different place. So, and the least in the senses, even though they are important, as you've heard, and by way of particular knowledge. Particular knowledge is sense information. It's sensory information. By way of particular knowledge, we arrive at universal understanding, as we said before. That's an appeal to the concept of experience, which is one way of arriving at potentially flawed, but workable first principles. That when you're working with them, you acknowledge as you're working with them that they may not be completely true, and you may have to change what those are depending on more extensive experience. John, that's an interesting question. Explicit versus tacit experience. I think that has to do more with learning and teaching. But I will admit right now, my brain is a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So I may not have the granularity to address your question with the depth that I would prefer to address it. So here, Carilao again claims that only understanding of all the mental faculties, only understanding deals in truth. Because understanding synthesizes information that starts from scientific knowledge, first principles, and takes into account experience, knowledge that comes in through the senses. And it's the only one that deals in truth, reason, understanding, that sort of thing. Memory is just a process. It is considered a mental faculty, but it's just a process that stores information for you to build your own body of experiential knowledge, which is not scientific knowledge, but it's still useful. Here's where the word art is capitalized, and I figured that was probably important. So
Be careful about
Carranza is
assigning importance in 17th century text to punctuation or to capitalization or anything like that. That could just be
true.
the compositor.
Running out of
three or
letters?
four compositors working on that text, and he just
Gotcha.
capitalizes because he happened to have a capital A on hand. Be
Yeah,
real careful.
fair enough. Thank you.
Yeah.
There is sort of an aphoristic statement that happens there, though, which I thought was interesting. If we consider art to be a body of knowledge, like scientific knowledge, like science, scientific knowledge, and art can all stand in for one another, know for now that by culmination of our reasoning, in other words, the conversation they've just had, that one part of the Destreza consists in art, in scientific knowledge, and the other in experience. What belongs to art, science, are the true precepts and the fundamentals, the first principles that compose it, which can never be altered according to Aristotle, because that's the definition of a first principle. A first principle is a factual thing that will never, ever change. If you want like a nice modern example, you can think of the gravitational constant of the universe. It doesn't change. So the strength and weakness are the weakness and strength, because you cannot have two contraries in a single subject. So scientific knowledge is about things that do not change, and the reason he calls on contraries is because the only way contraries can switch from one to another is through change. So what belongs to practice is diligence in the application of techniques. Does that sound a bit like habit? Sounds a little bit like habit to me. Diligence in the application of techniques, lightness to exit them, preventing the potential for the opponent to take advantage of them. Advice in these same things to adapt them according to the place and the time, which sounds a lot like a particular. Never doing anything in the stressa from which cannot arise a provable cause. So don't do things without reason. You know, if somebody throws a thrust at me, I could potentially punch it with my offhand. It's not a good idea. There's no good causes to back me up on this. But I have other options that are backed up by good causes and good reasoning and good prudence that will allow me to participate in this combat in a reasonable way that will keep me safe. And the causes are really important. You got to know the whys of what you're doing, because if you don't know the whys of what you're doing, the technique will fail when you're in danger. Like, it'll fail in the clutch. If you don't know, I'm sure we've all been there when we're just starting to learn fencing and we're like, okay, I'm in a bout, and this is, oh God, what do I do now? Things will fail when you're in danger. So something interesting happens here. You know, Meliso's like, all right, so once you know all that stuff above and how we measure the body, how do we manage ourselves in the differences of postures? Like how do we move? What do we do to get from one posture to another? And Carila's like, you'll know how to gain what is lost in one profile and what parts need to be regulated so that you can make good on your attack. Because understand that the techniques, although you know they are movements, are composed of different lines, and now again we're reaching back into first principles. And each line has its nature from which are composed the attacks. So the attacks are literally built on first principles, formed from movements that are angular, acute, obtuse, circumflex, mixed, and each kind of movement is applied to a different part of the body. And because all affects and actions have their impetuses, so like, here's where we're definitely talking about a practical syllogism. We're talking about the things that drive us to do a thing. You know, the causes that drive us to do a thing. So because all causes, all affects, and I use cause a bit wibbly here, so watch me, right? Because all affects, because all emotions have their impetuses, have their things that drive them, things that kick them off, with which they move us. So like, I might see an adorable kitten being incredibly cute, and that might make me like come close to tears because I can't cope from the cute. The impetus for my tears is the cuteness of the kitten, and the cuteness of the kitten triggers an affect in me, and that affect will be a driver for an action, which for me would be to go and pick up the cute kitten. It's the same thing with, all sweet things must be tasted. That over there is a sweet thing. I'm going to go taste the sweet thing. So here we're having a little bit of a comparison between physical impetus, which tracks back to Aristotle's physics, where he says, if you want something to move away from its center, then you have to give it energy. You've got to give it some kind of energetic impetus. So if I want a rock to move up, I have to throw the rock up. I can't just let it go because it's going to want to move to the natural center, which would be the center of the earth, because we now understand how gravity works, but that was how they were conceiving gravity at the time. In the same way that I've got to put energy in the rock to throw it up, something has to come in to change my affect, which will then drive me to act. And you have to understand. It's a tiny bit of know thyself, but it's also a little bit of know the other person. But it's definitely know thyself, because if you know yourself, then your movements will be of the right genus or category of the impetus, and will be equal to the will of the one who receives or initiates the attack. If not, if you're not fully in control of yourself and somebody does something at you, you're going to respond out of proportion, and that'll get you in trouble. And now we've reached the end of Pacheco's first dialogue, and I did want to point out this section here, in italics. Pacheco attributes this stuff to Carilao, but it's actually Meliso that speaks it in Carranza's original. So Carilao is he's summarizing everything. He says, therefore, by having the body measured or regulated in all of its profiles and the degrees applied to all of the movements, which are the ones that determine the distance of all things, you get an infallible, universal, against all the profiles and postures, movements, steps, and strikes, to not be in doubt about your defense and the offense of the opponent, serving as a universal in all postures, in any kind of attack you want to make. And then there's an edit. It's fairly seamless in the sense that the grammar is not interrupted. But this last bit that's being spoken is actually said by Meliso, even though it's said by Carilao here. So I'll go back a clause so it all makes sense. Serving as a universal in all postures and any kind of attack you want to make. And of all the things invented, this was the only one left to reduce to a science. And with it, there will be far less badness and vices, exiling them, because the arts are the teacher of virtue. So the conclusion here is, I set out to make Destreza a science, and I have made Destreza a science. And it was a long time coming and should have happened long ago, but I did it. And the reason that we want Destreza to be a science is so that we can rely on the truth of it, because it's derived from first principles, to then inform us in particular situations how to virtuously defend ourselves through prudence in a way that keeps us safe and efficiently manages what we're trying to do, either defend ourselves or offend the other guy. Okay. Thank you so much for plowing that through that thing with me. I do know that it was a lot. And now would be the time for questions. I can't guarantee I'm gonna be able to respond well, but I'll do my best.
All right, so let's open it up for questions. I think we have a small enough group that if you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and unmute.
Can I ask just a super quick question? We were talking earlier about 1618 text that you have, Lois.
Yeah.
That is, are you talking about Carranza's original or Pacheco's Compendio?
No, I'm talking about Carranza's original. It comes out of the National Library of France, and it literally says 1618. If you don't have it, are you on Facebook? Feel free to message me and I'll get you a copy.
Okay, yeah, I've never seen the 1618 copy, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm also sort of a wonder, Brent, how we have never crossed paths before. So
Probably because I'm not involved in the actual fencing community. I'm just purely an academic who ran across Carranza because I saw him mentioned so many times in other things that I was editing. I generally edit Spanish Golden Age, Spanish sort of theater, Calderón de la Barca, that kind of thing. And I ran across Carranza several times, and I was doing a note, like an annotation, another on a play, and then I just thought, this is really interesting. I tried to find a copy of Carranza so that I could make reference to it. Couldn't find a single modern edition of it.
Yeah.
And so I just sort of put that in my file, sort of, well, that's it. That could be an interesting project. And then I kind of came back to it and did some searching and realized, no, nobody has ever re-edited this book since 1580. And I thought, well, I'll give that a try. So yeah, I'm basically, all I'm doing is editing the Spanish text.
No. There's no such thing as all I'm doing.
Well,
No.
it's a lot of work, but
Right?
yeah, that's my goal here. So, and I hope it'll be useful to other people, obviously.
Oh, definitely.
Having a
Well,
good, because it's a really terrible text, just like physically, philologically,
Yeah.
bibliographically, it's a terrible text. Like the typesetting, it's just an endless block of text. It's full of abbreviations and run-on sentences with little or no punctuation. It's a mess. It's really, really difficult to read, even from, native speakers of Spanish. It's a very difficult text to read because it's just, it's a mess. So hopefully just cleaning it up and editing it, in a more readable format will be a step forward.
Yeah.
I think I have found you on Facebook and sent you a friend request, but I have a lot of contacts. We have a lot of contacts. So my wife is Dr. Mary Curtis, and she did her dissertation.
Yeah, I've read her dissertation, yeah.
Oh, good. But I don't know if you are familiar with Manuel Valle. He's probably in Spain the leading guy who works on this stuff. And then there's another guy who is Italian who also did a PhD dissertation on this.
Okay.
But,
yeah, I'd like to make contact for sure.
Yeah, I'd like to get you in contact with these guys. Manuel Valle runs a press, Agia Editoria, and they do reprints of the old books, but I've never heard them talking about doing Carranza, so I don't know if you have a publisher in mind, but I'm sure they would love to look at what you're doing.
Okay, sure.
So yeah.
The only actual fencing I've ever done is with Ken.
Oh, okay.
Nice.
Cool.
Just one very brief evening. We've been meaning to get together forever, but just hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So there were some questions earlier in the chat about second intention. Are the people that asked about that still here in the lecture? Maybe no. So just going to mention, I'm going to briefly talk about second intention and why it was interesting in the Carranza text. Because it's in fencing today, we talk about first intention, which is to attack an adversary as the first mover, what in Destreza we would call the proprio. And second intention in fencing today typically means an attack, which is followed by another action, right? But originally what it meant was to lay in wait for the adversary's movement, which was imported from rhetoric. So if somebody's making an argument in first intention, you have a pretty good guess as to what they're going to do. So you've got your counter argument prepped. And Carranza says that this is really the best Destreza, is to respond to the adversary's motions, converting them rather than countering them. So it's a bit tricky because that term has changed meaning. Wait, I want to see the cowbell meme again, please.
Oh no, I gotta bring this back. Of course you're seeing that screen. That's silly. Let's bring this back over. There you go. Oh, let me bring this out of the way. Stop cluttering my screen. There we go.
All right. Any other questions before we let everybody go? So I'll just like close, and if anybody jumps in before we stop. But
No.
obviously this is there's too much Carranza to handle in one lecture. So we have talked to Lois about doing a series as she preps the work. If you are interested in seeing this in English and getting a chance to chew on it yourself, I strongly encourage you to fund her work by donating, a small sum to her Patreon, and that will get you access to the translations and a community of people that can talk about it together. So, Lois, thank you so much. This is a huge amount of effort that you're doing, and we're really looking forward to everything that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for sticking through this. This could not have been a light, friendly, happy, shiny little lecture.
It was great to meet you, Lois, and all of you, actually.
It's wonderful to meet you. I am definitely going to friend you on Facebook because I believe in your cause and wish to subscribe to your newsletter.
All right.
All right. Well,
you.
good night, everybody, and we will set up another lecture for Lois in the near future.
Yeah, it may be a little while because I still have to get started on the third dialogue. So, balancing the analysis of the second dialogue and actually getting the third dialogue translated is its own beast.
Third dialogue is very meaty.
I was afraid of that.
Yeah. But it's not as entertaining as the second one, which is really just, like theater, parody, satire.
Yeah.
But
So the funny thing is I've got an MFA from Columbia in playwriting. So the moment I'm reading the second dialogue, I'm like, this needs to be performed. This is
I actually considered I was going to do a paper at a Golden Age theater conference. The second dialogue as theater, like basically Carranza is putting on a show in a sense, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I sort of look at this book as like Eudemio is this protagonist character, and I've like that OODA loop where the Destreza says you need to know and then apply the knowledge to see the paths forward. So it's like knowledge, perception, decision, and action. And by the time we get to Eudemio's like maturation, his understanding of fencing has evolved, and he says, now that I know, I'm going to go tell my friends in the marketplace about the false fencing and the dangers of it. And he hits that same loop, right? Now that I know, right, I perceive, I will act. And it just tracks up perfectly, like he's now lined up with this method. I really like that idea.
I think if and when we have an eventual Destreza moot where everyone comes together, I think we should stage this.
Oh
I've
gosh,
often thought it would make a great little play.
Yeah.
If we edit it.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I wanted to do was to modernize all the speech. So like you do get Charila going, nah, dude, listen, it's touch, and this is why it's touch. And do that because I have a lot of friends here in Australia who are voice actors. They're in the gaming industry and things like that. So it wouldn't be difficult if I had the money, which is what the Patreon is for, to then, get a recording studio and a text. And I've done voice direction, so I'm not worried about that. And just get that done as a podcast. How much fun would that be?
Yeah, the second one
Especially
would have
when-
a lot of laugh track, that's for sure.
Yeah, right. And the best part
second
is,
one's always like, the guys trying to contain their laughter said,
right? Exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah. And the best part is, of course, it's going to be all Australian actors, and I'd be like, no, just be Australian. No, you can be. It's fine. So, but that's in the future. That's when I have a clone.
We have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to historical swordplay, but the Spanish stuff is a big mountain to climb. All right, I should drop, but it has been great
Yeah.
to see everybody again. I will
Yeah,
try to
thank
get
you,
this
everyone.
lecture posted soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Lois. That was
And-
amazing.
Oh,
Thank
Great
you.
work.
Thanks, Lois. Great job.
I,
Yeah, we'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you, Lois.
Thanks, Lois.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night,
night.
everyone.
Did a wonderful